Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Welcome, Pacesetters of Agribusiness, to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod. I'm your host, Joe Mosier. Thanks for choosing to spend your time with us today. You know, as we sit here in Q4, we're really looking down the barrel of the end of a calendar year and the start of a new one. And while I think it's somewhat of an arbitrary milestone, that doesn't make it unimportant. Sure, there's nothing inherently special about December 31st versus January 1st, but as a society, we put a lot of stock in, and I think we get tremendous value from the ritual of rolling from an old period into a new period. If you think about it, as leaders, this is the time of year where we start to think about where our businesses are and where we want to take them. What opportunities are we chasing today, and how do those line up with the opportunities we think we ought to be pursuing in the future? What's working, what's not working, right? It's a time of reflection, a time of recalibration and alignment and recentering on where to go tomorrow. In this show, we talk a lot about, and I'll admit we might even belabor, the importance of taking calculated risks and taking measured actions in pursuit of actualizing your strategy. Right? We talk at length about how you need to have that vision for the future and stay rooted in it as an anchoring point for the decisions that you take today. But what we have not spent a lot of time talking about, in my opinion, is actually developing the underlying strategy. And while we haven't completely neglected it, I just think we're overweight the execution relative to the development. And while that might always be the case, I do think we can do better. And so I've started to think about, okay, how can we start to talk about in a meaningful way, in a way that is additive to the significant online content, the literature, all the information out there on developing strategy? How can we highlight the perspectives and lessons and voices that will actually equip you all with some of the things that you need to develop better strategy? And so today I'm really excited to share with you a conversation that I had recently with Mac Marshall. Mac has quite the pedigree if you're not familiar with him. Mac currently works in product strategy at Apeel, where they are looking for ways to scale plant-based edible coatings that preserve fruit and vegetable production to reduce on-farm, in-transit, in-store, and at-home food waste. A really important and noble vision. Now, Mac himself has spoken at countless ag conferences, and his past professional experiences include providing market intelligence for the soybean industry, market economic and trade analysis at Bayer, corporate strategy, strategic planning, and regulatory government affairs at Monsanto. And he started his career as an economist at the Bureau of Labor Statistics with the Producer Price Index, where he was specifically analyzing the wholesale price movement and trends for agricultural commodities, specifically livestock, meat, and field crops. Now, what you're going to hear today is Mac is passionate, in addition to all of that, about improving the strength, durability, and adaptability of strategy through the pairing and the marriage of economic analysis and effective storytelling. So in our conversation, we're going to talk about the intersection of strategy and context. We'll spend some time with, what does good strategy look like, enduring strategy in a seasonal crop cycle driven environment like ag, how to maintain strategic standards and discipline when you're in this period of high volatility and real low predictability, and a variety of other factors and in different directions we take the conversation. Now, brief warning, this episode's a little longer than usual, and that's because both Mac and I indulge our curiosity and we take the conversation in different directions, but I know that there's something in here for you, in fact, quite a bit, and I trust that you'll find it worth the time. So thank you for taking the time to tune in today and being part of the Pacesetter Pod community. And with that, let's jump over to my conversation with Mac Marshall of Apeel. Mac, it is good to see you today. Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod.
No, thanks for having me on, Joe. Great to see you.
Likewise. We've talked a lot about having this come together, and we had some rescheduling along the way. That's what happens with two guys with busy schedules, but here we are. Mac, we're going to get to your introduction here in a few minutes, but today I really want to spend time talking about the importance of developing good, rigorous strategy, some of the constraints that our current as well as our industry constraints have on developing effective strategy. And so we're going to go a lot of different angles and perspectives on that, but maybe you can start us off today by talking about, from your perspective, the process of developing and delivering a strategy that is anchored in, let's say, a robust and clear-eyed understanding of the context in which it'll be pursued, because the context is as important as what it is you're trying to accomplish. So kind of how do you see that interplay, and how would you talk about that?
Well, when it comes to strategic planning and helping build out a plan that, can really be for any organization, I'm going to focus mostly on commercialization. Most of the audience, I think, is going to be, private sector oriented, and that's where the bulk of my experience comes. Is, you really have to begin with the end in mind, right? What's the reason that in ag tech, what's the reason why you're starting out in the lab and, building and ideating? You really need to think about, okay, what is this product? What is the service that I'm making? How is it actually going to land and transact in the marketplace? What problems is it solving for? And how am I monetizing that? And so these are all questions that are months, if not years, away from being answered. So you have to, I think, begin with that as a starting point and recognize that, okay, just because I'm starting out in a lab or, doing some early stage trials, if I'm not beginning with, true commercialization in mind, then, it simply becomes an academic exercise, which is great. But, one of the things that I'm fond of saying, particularly in talking with ag tech audiences is, the most important step of that scientific method is step 6, when you're actually bringing it out and adding to the greater quotient of knowledge in the world, right? And that's where pre-commercial approaches and strategies truly get tested, is when they're actually out in a commercial environment. And so that means with each step along that roadway, because one of the ways that we think about it at the company I'm with now is it's a roadmap, right? It's somewhat of an overwrought metaphor, but when you build a strategy, you're effectively building a roadmap. Now, a roadmap is a plan. A roadmap is not the terrain that you're actually driving on. You can be moving along your roadway. Let's say we're taking a ride from Los Angeles to Orlando. There are a number of ways we could get there. We could fly from LAX to Orlando. We could take a train. We could drive. We could take a bus. If we're driving, somewhere along the way, there might be new information that comes up. I could get to Corpus Christi, Texas, and say, oh, you know what? There is this accelerated highway that I did not know about when I was back in Los Angeles. This will somehow take me through the Gulf of Mexico all the way to Orlando in faster time than could have ever anticipated before. So even when you're envisioning something early on, the recognition, one, that how it's going to transact from the theoretical into the practical and applied, those are foundationally different. Like, there's a reason the adage that just because it's success in the lab doesn't mean it's going to be a success in the marketplace. The same applies to, building a strategy. And I think the other piece of that, so that you can really kind of, minimize, that variance in the plan between what you've ideated and what you've actualized, when you're actually commercial, that has to just be informed with a whole suite of diverse perspectives. I think that is really one of the most essential things that I've learned throughout the course of my career, is that if you don't have diverse perspectives coming in to help formulate, a strategy here, you're going to be missing things. Strategies are not formulated strictly by a research and development department.
Mm-hmm.
They're not formulated strictly by a commercial department. They're not formulated strictly by your supply chain or your marketing. All of these entities really need to work together to help evaluate that. If I've gone and I've developed, and I work in product strategy right now, if I said, hey, I've got this great product, it's got this phenomenal efficacy, we're going to go deploy it in countries X, Y, and Z next year, but I haven't talked to the commercial team. I haven't understood, okay, well, actually this product might not actually land in this market because you've got no regulatory clearance, or there's already an incumbent which is priced much lower and we can't compete with it on a cost basis in that particular market because they've got backing from the government. There could be little things like that where if you're really just planning something in a silo and not integrating other members of the team and taking a full cross-functional collaborative approach, you might still succeed.
Mm-hmm.
But that's going to be, in my estimation, bad process, good outcome. I think you're maximizing the potential of a successful outcome in terms of, commercialization, success, and profitability if you're building the right process back through it. With the recognition that plans are not static. I think it was Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the face. Well, what innovator out there, what entrepreneur hasn't gotten punched in the face once or twice and had to pivot and think about things differently? One of the things I love listening to is I love listening to corporate histories, and I love listening to, podcasts like Business Wars or Acquired. You learn the history of a corporation or even a small company or even a product line that has become so ubiquitous and, is just a center of daily life. And you're like, oh, wow, there were a lot of missteps early on and a lot of blind spots that are really easy to see from the back. It's like, oh, well, they didn't do any customer research. They didn't, appropriately segment the market. There wasn't a good testing of the product before it actually went out into the hands of customers. These are like corporate history is littered with these examples. And I think it's important to recognize these are, going back to the roadmap example, that isn't to say that all of a sudden there's a Grand Canyon along the highway that I can't pass anymore on my drive from Los Angeles to Florida. It's to say, oh, you know what? This is not going to be a week-long drive. This might be a 14-day drive because we've got to go around this way. And you know what? We've got to, maybe bad example given the geography I mentioned, but maybe we've got to put snow tires on. And that's a different wrinkle in here as part of the overall preparation that we have and that we're building along that journey to actually bring a product to marketplace. So that strategy is requiring a whole host of different, contexts, so that you can have an aggregated context that is built from a number of different perspectives from within your organization and from outside of your organization as well. And this can apply for a commercial plan. I think this can apply for how you approach, stakeholder relations as well. All of these things come together. It's understanding where, your counterparties are coming from, who's involved with them, who has the pockets of information, and how you put it all on the table in front of you so you can, again, use an override metaphor, see all the chess pieces at once.
And there's also an interplay here, as I'm listening to your examples, diversity of perspectives, internal and external, the commercial team, the product team, the R&D team, the supporting platform technologists, et cetera. But there's also the interplay from the quantitative and the qualitative analysis as well, because you're going to, using that example of deploying a product in Latin America, there's going to be the quantitative measures of what does the consumer base of that pyramid look like? What's the size of the producers? What's the acreage they represent? What's their use cases, et cetera? What's the publicly available data we can aggregate there? And there's the qualitative of, is this actually a problem that they've expressed it's a priority to be solving? The qualitative of, what is the stage of the regulatory discussion such that they could provide clearance or a framework by which you could get clearance to deploy and test and ultimately, roll out at scale. And so in this also, I mean, imagine there's something around merging that what you can know through numbers and what you can know through sentiment in the process as well.
Absolutely. And I think maybe to hit that first, I want to come back to a point from before. So I think I've been very fortunate over the balance of my 20-year career where I've gotten to see the world of ag from a number of different perspectives, from government, from large private sector, from association, from independent consulting, as well as, smaller startup. And with that, diversity of perspective, or at least being exposed to people who have diversity of perspective, through those various experiences, what I think I've really come to appreciate is that for you to have, an approach or a strategy or something that is going to have traction, it's not just getting that buy-in from all those different groups, but it's also learning to converse in multiple languages. And what I mean by that is within the construct of how do you think about quantitative and how do you think about qualitative? My background's in economics and trade, right? Like I started out, deep into Excel sheets. I spent a lot of my life deep in Excel sheets and Google Sheets and everything. Still do a lot of that now. But it's one thing for me to look at a market opportunity simply based on the merit of, one data point. Take, for example, I think the biggest disconnect between perceived size of the prize and operational hurdles, we can take China, for example, right? Like you want to take China as like a huge, consumer and producer market, definitely a huge producer market in terms of, agricultural productivity, also a large importer. Okay, great. I want to access the Chinese market. okay, well, what's your appetite for risk on intellectual property protections? What's your appetite for risk on, not having full ownership of your company? What's your appetite for risk on giving away parts of the empire, so to speak, just to do the operation? So the top line size of the prize might look really impressive, 9, 10, 11 figures. But once you square it against the risk associated with that and the execution risk and like some of the value that you could be leaving on the table, to say nothing of, have you done the qualitative analysis that you brought up of, is the solution that I'm bringing actually solving for a problem in the marketplace? Or is this just my external perception based off of metrics alone that I'm applying to a market? And that could be faulty. So you have to have that counter check. And going back to, before, like if I sit in strategy at corporate headquarters of wherever, I can say that this market opportunity looks great, like 5 billion, whatever. But if I haven't talked with my commercial team, they're like, oh yeah, no, we've known that for 10 years. Let me parse that for you and tell you what that really means. Then
Yep.
I've developed something that's fragile. But, in my time working in strategic roles across a couple different, organizations and companies, as well as working in, government relations type work as well, it all comes down to how do you think about what is the message that you want to carry to your stakeholder and how are they going to perceive it? And this is, again, what I mean by multiple languages. There are some stakeholders who are going to overly anchor on, the numbers. And that's important. Like I love speaking in numbers. There are some who are going to orient on the story, but those are corner solutions. In my estimation, I think the most powerful messaging that you can give, the most powerful set of information that you can give to your stakeholders so they can make a choice that is going to be in a mutual best interest. So it could be dilemma sharing. Hey, here's the issue that I have as a company. Let me take it to, you as a political stakeholder and say, hey, there's actually some shared dilemma here. Or, me as a seller, you as a buyer. I know my product can potentially help solve this issue that you have. How do I frame it in terms of, okay, this is the value around it, rather than me saying, I can solve your problem. I can solve your problem and it will generate towards this change in unit economics for you. That's a much more powerful story. Like once you can, I like to say like the easiest way to get someone to care about a number is to put a currency symbol next to it because you've added context. Like you have turned a number from being something abstract into something that, actually sticks with people. And the reciprocal of that, so numbers without context don't really mean anything. And the reciprocal of that is a story that hasn't been validated or has some degree of quantitative rigor put behind it. Particularly if you're getting into, hey, there's a discussion that we're going to have with, potential investors. There's a discussion we're going to have with our board. There's a discussion we're going to have with a potential commercial partner here. If that's not all laid out, as part of the homework for it, yeah, again, things might still transact, but I don't think it's as strengthened in advance. So much like, from before, you want to have that good process that underpins and maximizes your chance of a successful outcome there, whether it's, commercial or relational.
Yeah, I mean, that's spot on. A lot of the work that we do and a significant amount of the content we produce in this podcast is belaboring the point of agribusinesses pursuing a merger or acquisition, of course, need to anchor the economics and the rationale for that transaction in a pre-existing strategy. There are, from time to time, opportunistic, unanticipated opportunities to acquire a technology, acquire a team, acquire a set of assets, acquire a competitor that do create strategically aligned value. But the number of times that an opportunistic deal comes up and it's sort of justified retroactively because folks like the idea of owning it or simply not letting somebody else own it causes all sorts of problems. What we're doing here, though, is we're actually saying, okay, in the context of an acquisition, to be able to anchor the rationale, the business case for that transaction, the expected outcomes that justify the capital and operational risk that you're going to take on, they need to be anchored to a pre-existing strategy. And that strategy unto itself is also fairly complex. And so it's really important that you're thinking about these things absent a specific, you should be thinking about your strategy absent a specific product, absent a specific growth objective, absent a specific sort of lane by which you could succeed into the future, and actually taking a pretty a wide lens around, okay, what is it we're trying to create long term? What are the things that we believe and know to be true about the market and the conditions that we're operating in? What are the things that we believe we can do differently and better than others? And then now, based on that, we're going to down select the various levers to pull. And from there, we start to collect our data and our diversity of perspectives to sort of build that out, against which we can do all sorts of number of things and feel confident that they are strategically aligned to a robust and rigorous strategy and strategic plan.
It's really well said, Joe. And there are two, I'd say, just life examples that I'd gotten from, various mentors over the years that I think nest into that well. When you're overly prescriptive on what your path is going to be, I'd say without that flexibility. So let's go back to that. Hey, there could be there could be something on the table where it's like, I can take an opportunistic approach and it's like, hey, look, there is this asset out there. There's this company out there. There's this team out there that can really be catalytic if I bring them in. I didn't know about them when I left LA in my Pinto. But when my Pinto broke down in Corpus Christi, I saw all these, really cool flotation devices I could take to get down to Orlando. I'm still getting there, or I saw that pipeline to get to Orlando, whatever the means of conveyance is. And I offer two means of conveyance. One, okay, might be that super fast way. One might be this made up fan boat that I just came up with. But when I'm at that juncture, now I'm presented with, okay, here's an additional potential opportunity. I've had this roadblock here where my initial plan has gone awry. My Pinto stopped working. I'm in Corpus Christi. I got to get to Orlando. Well, my strategy was just to get to Orlando, but there's probably one better way to do it than not. Like if it's get to Orlando with enough time, and with that incremental time, I can, that's a bankable asset I can redeploy in my business. I'm probably better off taking this rapid way to get there and finish out like what I've mapped out as my plan of getting to Florida. Or I can take this other slower path, which might be exciting and cool and a shiny object because, hey, it's a fan boat. That'll be fun. Those are two different paths that can potentially lead to getting to the same place, but one has a little more fidelity of thought in it than the other. Not that example had a whole lot of fidelity of thought behind it, but I do like, kind of simple ones here.
Well, I feel like we've been burying the lead here, Mac, and there's a number of different angles we want to take on this, but let's take a minute now to talk a little bit about your background. So give us the Mac 101. I think your professional background, I think some of the work that you've done for the ag industry and how you're spending your time these days.
Yeah. So, as I said, I've been very fortunate to work in ag across a number of different vantage points. And again, I think having those, if it hasn't come across thus far, I really, really value being able to shift into different vantage points because I think that gives you more information. It gives you more decision criteria for decision fidelity. If I've only worked in one vocation my whole life, that's all I know. I can't possibly imagine the opportunities that might exist in another sphere. And that could be everything from, hey, I worked as an accountant this whole time. I don't know what it would be like to be a financial analyst. It could be something even as like very regimented as that. Now, so I've gotten to work in ag, first in government, later in Monsanto, in corporate strategy. Phenomenal. It was great. I got to, meet with and work with teams from all over the world, got to be on both sides of the merger there. Once Bayer bought Monsanto in 2018. So, through the course of that, it's like, okay, well, how do we think about what our plan is going to be for the future as we're continuing to introduce new hybrids and think about what the new markets are going to be and really think about the economics and trade-offs of commodity production in one market versus another. And this is really interesting stretch and shift that I've taken in the last year or so. So I've traditionally worked in the commodity space, whether it's Bayer Monsanto. I worked in in marketing promotion in the soy space for about 4 years, a lot of external talking and content development, some private consulting as well. And with all of that, I really enjoyed getting to, kind of first see how ag worked, but in a very observing capacity. One of the interview questions that I got when I was interviewing at Monsanto was, Mac, you've only worked in the public sector to this point. What do you think the difference is between the public sector and the private sector? And the way that I answered it at the time was, I work at BLS, which, side note, never thought that of all the places I've worked in the past, that would be the most newsworthy one, but that's where we are in 2025, where the Bureau of Labor Statistics is your daily headline.
As
Digression
a
over.
side note, listeners, we're speculating what's the percentage of people listening to this episode that would have known what the BLS stood for 60 days ago versus now. We're guessing it's up considerably. One of the sleepy, critical back office agencies and teams within the federal government. But sorry, Matt, continue.
No. It's interesting, right? Like sometimes when attention gets shown on something, it has these kind of indirect knock-on effects where it's like it's increased, the overall awareness and appreciation for what a sleepy agency does. So I was asked, okay, what do you think the difference is between the public and private sector? And so at BLS, we produce the numbers. We collected the data, we measured the data, we disseminated the data. We don't opine on the data. It's not like, oh, do you think we're entering a recession? That's not our job. The glass is neither half full nor half empty. What we would say is it's a 16-ounce glass with 8 ounces of water in it. Give it the most objective answer you can give. So I gave that preamble, and I said, now here's the difference. In the government, in that particular role, I'm observing. I'm strictly a market observer. I am commenting on how much water is in that glass. In the private sector, I will have a role in determining how much water is in that glass. That's, it's the action versus the observation. With that, I got to embark on, I think, a lot of, great experiences over that time, but still very, very centered around row crops. So now I work for a company that's based out of Southern California called Apeel Sciences. What we work on are post-harvest coatings for fresh produce and treatments that enable shelf life extension and quality preservation, all in the interest, really, of combating food waste globally, which is a tremendous issue. It happens both on farm and post-harvest. We're specifically in the post-harvest space here. While being able to realize and confer, financial benefits to our customers, right? So like through shelf life and extension and quality preservation, you're able to sell more. You're able to be recognized increasingly for the quality of the produce that you're selling. But there's also a component I think that really needs to be understood across all of agtech, which is when you're in the input business, you are foundationally in the de-risking business. And what I mean by that is, in a lot of instances, look, you view insurance, you view inputs, you view those as line item expenses rather than as things that can, truly enhance your operation and cut costs. And, in low margin environments, and I think this is particularly relevant for, row crop commodities where we are now, farmers are all price takers. And so when it comes to the approach you're going to have when approaching, going to market, it's like, okay, well, how is my product or service? How can my company come in and give them some opportunity on margin? Now, maybe it's increasing the efficiency of production, so they're getting margin on the output side. In a commodity environment that is feeling a lot of price pressure right now, particularly in the United States, that's a more challenging value proposition than saying, hey, if you switch over from using, this particular input to something that we produce, you're getting, analog performance relative to like your prior input. But with us, we have operational savings. We're able to, reduce these other input costs that exist as well. And that gets into, I think, going back to before, how do you position the value proposition of your company's service or product offerings and contextualize them in the language of your customer and understand like their piece there. And really that customer qualification, needs assessment, and everything, I think is number one with a bullet of, what needs to get mapped out in advance. And so, all of that, I've been very fortunate to meet with ag customers from around the world. I've met farmers from I don't know how many countries. And, even as means of production are very different and styles of production are very different in many parts of the world. I've been to smallholder farms where, a farm might be smaller than my backyard, which is a suburban quarter-acre lot, or it could be literally tens of thousands of hectares in Brazil. But ultimately, the economic challenge that every producer, especially ones that were price takers, have to face is, how am I going to balance that margin equation? How am I going to produce the right amount? But what can I control and endogenize, particularly on the cost side, that is going to help, provide that margin revenue protection. I'd say even going back to my time in Monsanto, and this is, that was my first experience working for an input company. I truly did feel that we were foundationally in the risk mitigation insurance business. I used to get questions all the time. Hey, when's corn getting back to $4? So this is a time, like when I came to the company, I think we were at $4.75 a bushel. And, after, some, and there were some China issues, I think in the, earlier part of that decade. And then, a couple years of really strong production, particularly out of Brazil, which has been growing in volumetrically substantially, the last 20, 30 years. All those, there's definitely a lot of headwinds on commodity price. So I get questions all the time. It's like, when are we getting back to 450 corn? And what would stick in my mind was, I get why we're asking that question, because that question is a proxy for what is the economic performance of our customer base. But the question for me isn't, when do we get back to 450 corn? The question for me is, when can our customer base have a more predictable revenue stream? And by extension, how can we have a more predictable revenue stream? And then you turn that question around and say, what can we do internally so that we can position our customer to have a more predictable revenue stream so that we can have one? So it's like you start to see these different nodes and connectivities and linkages come together, and you're like, okay, well, what if I ask that question around in a different order? Does that change how I would answer it? Does it change my approach?
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
So one of the things that I want to bring up here is you're talking about that customer in non-ag context. Imagine that you're a tier 2 automotive part supplier, right? And you're looking at what new vehicle sales and used vehicle sales are doing around the country. People are hurting, they're trading their vehicles less. Used vehicle sales are growing relative to new vehicle sales, whatever it might be, right? I don't actually know where we're at right now, but you would have a certain set of criteria and factors you would look at to say, okay, what's likely to change such that our customers can start buying new vehicles, which is going to make the auto manufacturers sending demand signals to us for what it is that we produce, et cetera. Now, something I hear far too often, and which is probably only sometimes true, is how things are different in ag, right? So we like to believe that we are so different that we can't probably learn anything from the rest of the world. And this show is a big part of my effort to challenge that assumption and say there's a lot of universal business truths, whether it's from processes, management philosophies, lessons learned, et cetera, that can be repurposed and applied within ag. But today I'm going to concede the point, and we'll give our listeners some red meat and acknowledge that strategy development in ag, and in this context of a one shot on goal a year industry like ours, is a little bit different. And so as you're going through these process of saying, what do we need to do to generate and to support farmer profitability such that we can have stable profits for our entity? What is the market telling us is the need that we are uniquely positioned to produce and meet, and that we can monetize and grow our startup? All these different things, starting with the end in mind, as you talked about in the commercialization aspect early on, they are true everywhere. But within ag, they're constrained by how much of our work occurs in this, what I'll call a low iteration environment. Now, perhaps in a lab, you can simulate a post-harvest surface application of a preservative many, many times over at a molecular level to simulate it. But in the real world, you're constrained to the seasonality of the business and the duration of a crop cycle. So with that in mind, given, again, what I'm going to call the low iteration environment, it inhibits your ability to learn to deploy observe, improve, redeploy. How do you coach leaders or agribusiness leaders to think differently in how they make decisions and how they set priorities, knowing that these boundary conditions of a single sales season, a single crop, a single harvest are always going to be there in the background?
I've thought about this from a number of different angles, so I don't know which one to begin with first. Maybe it'll just be like, let's take software development as an example, right? Because there's like in the context of ag, there are so many softwares and platforms and everything being developed for in-field precision services or diagnostics or recommendations on rate application, all these things, right? I think it's really important to remember, like in software, right? You're focused on, hey, how do I get a minimally viable product out there and iterate it as much? And you're talking about a low iteration environment, right? Like I can put a beta out, iterate it, debug, and I can do a sprint a week for a year,
Right.
right? I can get 52
Exactly.
iterations of it, or even going back further in history. Why did the first geneticists work with fruit flies? Well, you work with fruit flies because they reproduce really quickly. So each generation is so short-lived, so you can get a lot of generations in a very short window of time. And that's what it all comes down to, is this, what I think of is a temporal disconnect, but one that we have to better appreciate through scaling. So I forget what book it was. I think I was reading The Earth Transformed by, I think this is the book by Peter Frankopan. And it's kind of a history of, basically intersections between large geological events and food and agricultural production throughout history. And apologies if I'm getting the book wrong here, but I do believe this is the book that I read this in. There was a notion about when we move to being an agrarian species, one that actually produced for consumable surplus, and eventually it cascades from there, that okay, you start to bring together trading partners and a diversified economy, and we could probably talk for 4 hours on that. I hope we get to do sometime. But in the context of this book, it said, okay, well, farmers had to really switch, or like in the transition to farming, humans had to switch to becoming strategic thinkers rather than just like, hey, farming and not having any exhaustible no sellable surplus. Like now you're starting to think, okay, multi-season, all these other things. And that triggered an interesting thought for me, because I do think that there is this misconception that exists. Maybe it's through hubris, maybe it's through just like a lack of understanding of the way things transact, in an agricultural setting, is that farmers are not strategic thinkers. It's like, well, hold on a second. It's just happening under a way different timeline than what, a lab R&D cycle is going to look like. Farmers begin with the end in mind, right? When they're making, and I'll use row crop example here, when they're making their purchases in the fall, that's concurrent or right after harvest, and it's done with the future year harvest in mind. So, it's literally like a 9 to 12 month cycle. So that might be a sprint in and of itself, but every decision goes towards one strategic end goal, and that is maximizing that profitability and the return that you get off the field when the combine goes through it. And that starts, everything from hybrid selection to crop plan to the insurance that you're going to get to the variable rate inputs throughout the course of the season. All of those are tactics that are being implemented in a very short window to execute on a strategy there. And a strategy that I might add that has to be nested in a larger multi-year, if not multi-generational strategy. So once we have that framing, we're not so different, you and I, between the lab and the field. And in this example, I'm saying I'm the one coming from the lab because I'm not a farmer. I've never been a farmer. You don't want me farming. As I'm coming from the lab, like, okay, you know what? I can understand this a little bit more. And I understand that in my lab development cycle, if I have some issue with an input, like I got a reagent that comes in badly and I can't conduct my experiment this week, that sets back all my lab protocols and the next generation iteration or the next sequence that I get to iterate on. Okay, great. That sets me back. I've got to spend some more. It delays my development cycle. And those are all real costs. Translate that back to the farmer's field, right? But those are one cost in one iterative cycle. One cycle of iteration for a farmer is the revenue for that year. So
Exactly.
when you're coming in and introducing, a changeover, you have to weight that accordingly. Recognize that, like, when you have a change come in that impacts your execution, your strategy, the same thing's happening when you're approaching a farmer. And I was thinking about this, before we were recording, going back to the notion of anyone in the input industry being in the de-risking business. Yeah, we are in the de-risking business. But the irony there is that for us to provide a de-risking solution for you as a customer, we're asking you to take on risk in changing over one of your existing practices. And, reconciling, that disconnect and how you smooth that and how, you can help bridge that gap, get past, that kind of chasm of unbelief that comes from, hey, here's how I've done things, to, hey, here's a new way to do things. Can I really bear that risk? Well, down the line, I can say, I can de-risk your operations. How do I de-risk your operation in the near term to help give you the faith to go with my service offering and go for it? And yes, I did all that in the context of farming, but I think it applies for any sort of business transaction where if you're focused on your customer and you can interrelate, you might not know their business to a T. You're not going to know it with the same fidelity that you know your own. But I think being able to see the analogs and appreciate their business through the lens of yours, but also your business through the lens of theirs, I think these are all things that factor into how you, again, build that strategy and then execute against it to maximize the chances of commercial success.
So I love what you said there. I'm going to say a couple of things back. So as I think out loud, bear with me. But this idea of understanding the multivariable nature of a farmer's annual purchasing decisions, planting decisions, et cetera. It's going to be rooted not just in their crop rotation plans, what they know about the productive capacity of their acreage, what they are forecasting of experience around likely weather patterns in the coming season, the cost of inputs, the availability of certain genetics and how they might perform in the field, the capacity of their equipment, the availability of labor, hell, even the decision to maybe stay with a commodified production row crop product as opposed to testing a higher value specialty product simply because the industrial infrastructure around you only sends demand signals for the commodified product. So the farmer's making all these, and I've simply just gone through a couple very high level ones there, but all of those decisions are coming in. They're making those decisions, all knowing on the back end of it, they're going to be a price taker, as you said earlier, Mac. It's almost a barbell effect. So if you're saying we want to introduce a new product, a new solution, a new technology that we think is going to help in one aspect, you have to do that work to understand, okay, what was the multivariable set of conditions by which they made their decisions last year and the year before and the year before that? Because all of those inputs actually calcify as resistance to really rolling the dice on changing something for the next year ahead, knowing that, as you said, the odds are you lose your revenue for the year if you upset the apple cart. And I think failure to appreciate frankly the sophistication quantitatively and qualitatively of that annual farm strategy, let's call it, likely leaves you a lot of blind spots where people are saying, the farmer adoption is the problem. Farmer adoption is the constraint, lack of grower sophistication, all these things we hear that are going to bemoan or somehow put the blame on lack of innovation at the farm gate, when it might be more of a reflection of a lack to understand and get intimately familiar with and appreciate the complexity of what those decisions are. Because if somebody comes in and actually understands with entirety and intimacy what all those inputs were, they likely are able to communicate a better value proposition and deliver a better product and service of growing that.
Well, I think, with that, you have to approach it with humility and respect. And I think that's one of the challenges that innovators can find. And the way that it gets talked about is farmer resistance to adoption or a lack of technical know-how. in my estimation, those aren't really the barriers, because the fact of the matter is, like, every farmer we're talking about here is a business person, right? No one's doing it strictly for altruism. Let's be real. So if you can kind of focus on the business realities of it, and just as you are your own business, then it's going to, maybe transact a little bit differently. I've developed this innovation in the lab. I'm incredibly excited about bringing it to market. It is my child. It is my baby. I'm bringing it to you into the world, and you're going to love what my baby can do for you. But then it's like all of a sudden on the other side of the equation, it's like, okay, you're handing me this baby here. I like how I've turned this from like a product into a baby. It's kind of funny if you think of it as a physical baby. But it's like, okay, now I've got this baby here. All right, this baby is it's going to take me a little bit more time to put this baby into my seed box, or, I've got to mix it with something else before I put it in my tank, but I am excited to try it. Or, oh, wait, I've got to do this whole other application method. I've got to change out my nozzles, just a couple like hardware examples here. But all of those are impositions. You are literally imposing, you are asking. And so just as me as the innovator with my baby innovation that I'm so happy of, I'm coming to you, the farmer, who's got their own baby, which is the production, their farm, their operation, maybe their first generation, maybe it's been in the family for multiple generations, but that's their baby. And you're coming and saying, hey, my baby can make your baby better. I got 2 kids. I know how I feel if someone said that to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess it depends on the day and how they've been acting, just like, hey, maybe I had a down year in yield, and it's and I feel like I have a little more traction on a yield enhancing technology the next year. But I think you get what I'm saying here is, treat the sanctity of your customers' operations the same way that you think about the sanctity of your own. Like it's a mutual respect. You want them to respect the rigor and the blood, sweat, tears, and everything that you've put into your product or your service. Understand that they're coming from the same perspective about their own.
Yeah, and so here's the other thing that I'm thinking here as we talk today, Mac, is we've covered a lot of ground around starting with the end in mind when you develop your strategy. And end in mind might be commercialization, it might be efficiency, it might be cost reduction, it might be market expansion, whatever that might be. Marrying that with a quantitative and qualitative and diverse input sort of set of perspectives to then basically be able to have a convincing and credible story to tell to those stakeholders to bring people along. In the course of doing it, of course, intimately understanding the problem to be solved and the nature of the operation of your customer. In this last example, it's the farmer. Now, we started talking about context was so important relative to what you wanted to accomplish. All of this is sort of a meta observation, I guess. All of this now exists within a larger context, and that is the wider economy and the wider environment. And so we're trying to iterate and innovate and grow in low iteration environments. We're trying to digest all this information. In addition to those physical, structural, and biological constraints on the business, we're now in a persistently high volatility, low stability environment, right? And so I guess when you think about this, you think about, we're in the trough of a commodity cycle. Costs of labor and inputs and equipment and fuel and everything are just at, near record highs, depending on the day and depending on which item you're looking at. As we record this, still China has yet to buy any new crop beans, and it's getting more and more dire and sort of threatening for the U.S. producer as we go. All these things exist off the farm, right? We have to navigate them. So how can leaders think long term, think in a multi-year context, and build strategy amid so much uncertainty? And maybe underlying that, I guess the other question is, should we even be developing multi-year strategic plans if we don't know what given the amount of volatility that we have today?
Well, I'd say that, the first one, will work backwards from it, right? I've worked in economic modeling for a long time, and, the fact is every model is wrong. Some are just more useful than others. So it's not about getting things right. It's about giving yourself the greatest confidence to make the right decisions. And that is, again, like you said, that's all predicated on, having the diverse set of input, making sure that you're covering a whole host of perspectives, and frankly, that there's respect for all the input coming in, but doing it, I'd say, in a structured and manageable fashion, right? You can't bring everybody under the proverbial tent at once, right? I more think of it as like you don't work in silos, but you work in concentric circles where you're gradually broadening out that circle, getting the full buy-in, and then moving from there. I'd say in terms of like the greater context, right? Yes, there's so much uncertainty out there, but I'll tell you what, like not planning isn't going to make things better. You can plan, you can map out scenarios, you can look through a couple different potentialities based off of what is prevailing now and based off of history. And then it becomes a collective decision about like, what is a must believe? What do we think is the most likely path forward? And knowing that things will change, how can we build the resilience in advance to best operationalize against that when those high volatility factors come in, whether, hey, it's a price spike here. Okay, well, have we hedged accordingly? Did we do enough forward contracting knowing that was a potentiality? This market access is shutting off here because of this trade lane issue. Okay, have we been proactively prepping for the, potential of, losing the trade lane from country A to country B? Have we thought about thinking of other supply lines around that? And so putting that all together, I'll just kind of frame it with, sports analogies, because I'm a 41-year-old man and sports analogies are kind of how I think. But it's not, it's admittedly, it's stolen from the greatest TV show of all time, which is The Wire, which
Agree.
is where one character is asking another. Spoiler alert, everyone. This is the preview towards Mac and Joe's future All Wire podcast. One character asks another, and it's a conversation between two drug dealers in West Baltimore, right? And one of them is focusing on legitimizing the money and getting into real estate development, and he eventually gets swindled by an unscrupulous city councilman. And so he goes back to his drug partner, and his drug partner is all furious with him for trying to get into this, legitimate side of development. He said, "What did I tell you about playing those away games?" And so that's what it comes down to, is the notion of home games and away games. And home games and away games can shift over time. So, empirical example, you mentioned China here, and the lack of new crop purchases here, at least for beans. For a long time, really going back to immediately post World War II, the U.S.'s home game as an agricultural producer was volumetric commodity production. Produce for surplus, do it low cost, leverage your post-World War II international status to advance that, and continue to grow and proliferate. It's been a tremendous boon for volumetric production of U.S. ag over the last, basically the rest of the 20th century. That is not a home game anymore. Look at a list of the major commodities produced out of Brazil. And we're just talking Brazil here. Like Brazil surpassed the U.S. in corn exports a couple of years ago, surpassed the U.S. in soybean exports, I think a decade ago, beef, chicken, all of that. Like in terms of volumetric production, that's Brazil's game now. And we can be upset about that. The U.S. producers can be upset about that. Or you have to think about, okay, well, what's the next home game that we can find? If it's not commoditized high volume production, if that's always going to be a race towards zero economic profitability, because when anything gets commoditized, the incremental value eventually does go to zero. Is it thinking about additional differentiation out there? Is it thinking about what are the other demand signals that are coming? So the demand chain, not the supply chain. So the demand chain, I can participate in that differently so that I'm not chasing getting an incremental bushel, which doesn't necessarily translate to profitability for me. I mean, I think this year the U.S. is going to grow the largest soy crop on record, and it's not benefiting farmers.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly not from a profit and loss standpoint. So, what can you do to turn those home games into away games? It can be, continue with the sports analogy, like the Denver Nuggets. They play in Denver. It's 5,000 feet in the air. If I'm running that team, like I'm leveraging my home court advantage and I'm getting athletes and I am running the other team up and down the floor every single time. All right. Let's say I'm the Minnesota Timberwolves who play in their division and I play them 4 times a year. Okay. That's your home game, Denver. I'm going to take away your home court advantage. I'm going to be running my guys 2-hour practices every single day that's not a game day, and we're going to be better conditioned, and we will come down to Denver, and it's going to be a horse race, and we're taking those 2 games.
Mm-hmm. To what degree, Mac, this home game, away game framework, which I do appreciate. So at a business level, so not at the national level, at a business level, is there a risk in, so I think in the short term, thinking about your home court advantage allows you to sort of dial in on frankly, it's a comparative advantage from a strategic sort of thinking standpoint. What are you uniquely positioned to do better, cheaper, faster, at a higher quality, whatever it might be, than your competitors?
Exactly.
Being really rooted in that and be very good at that. Might that not also, though, in your example of the US looking at volumetric, high volume, commoditized production, over time, you compete that away yourself. Other people come after it. Does it risk a business leader having a myopic strategy that over time fails to account for the fact that their home court advantage or home field advantage is actually eroded? Meaning, if you're only looking to play home games, are you going to lose the ability to ever sort of be able to shift that elsewhere? How do you strike that balance?
It's a phenomenal question. I think it's about understanding what builds up your home court advantage. The second question is, where can I transport what my home court advantage is to another arena, right? Is my solution transferable? So in that example, hey, like if we're really, really good at growing this one particular crop and we can grow it in high volume, that's been a win for a while. Okay, while the rest of the world catches up, how do we accordingly reinvest the windfalls from those high volume days? How do we reinvest that, or how do we reinvest that so that we can invent channels that will leverage our existing strengths, which have given us this home court advantage into a derivative home court advantage in another realm? Like, hey, if we've got the best universities, if we have the best private sector institutions that are working on, genetic diversity and like applications of crop systems, if we've applied them in a volumetric way for a long time, how do we apply them in a value-based unit value, perspective, where it's like, hey, you're driving the most out of every individual bushel or pallet or box or widget, rather than just, hey, we'll make it cheap, buy for a nickel, sell for a dime, and we're good.
Yeah. I'm thinking about a client we worked with earlier this year who, as part of their stated long-term multi-year plan, had an intention to diversify operations and the nature of their business, and in a very wide lens of what diversification would look like for them, to their credit. It wasn't simply, we want to be a 5-state operator as opposed to a 4-state operator. We're going to materially look at what does diversification mean for us, getting into retail, getting into value-added processing, getting into other aspects of their particular lane that they're in, et cetera. One of the things that they did in that course of that work, one of the things that we did was also spending some time discussing what are some of the unique capabilities that they had. One of them was that they had a demonstrated track record of significant capital investments in proven but to date largely unscaled manufacturing technologies that could improve the core agricultural product utilization and creating more value-added co-products and basically using more of the buffalo, if you will. Not novel technology to the world, but perhaps novel at scale. And they had found a way to do that. And so that's an example of where they identified some of their core capabilities that had actually made them not just why their business was strong, but had made sort of underlying why their business was strong. Then what they did is sort of say, and this is an ongoing process, but looking at that and saying, okay, these are the things that we have done uniquely better than others that have contributed to our success. In the context of diversification, which of these are transferable? Because if you think about the transferability of some of your strengths, then you start to say, okay, well, where would the transferable skills be additive in a diversification play? Or where do we get ourselves into something that we might very well become good at, but there's no breadcrumbs right now from here to there to show us that we will be good at it? And so I think that's maybe, as I think out loud here, another avenue of saying we need to shift home court advantage and start playing down the street, because we actually think we can play that game pretty well too.
So let's think about that and bring that back, because I love that. It's like, all right, let's up our game by going on the court that has the janky rim with no net, right? You'd said something there about like, hey, I have this cool, proprietary advantage that I have. It's maybe not novel small scale, but it's novel large scale. But if I'm not getting those leading signals that there's something I can do with this, it's a challenge. I'm having to take a leap of faith in a way, and I'm having to take on my own risk. If as I look inwardly at my business operations and I'm thinking about, okay, how do I transition and make it so as many of those arenas out there, as many marketplaces that I want to play in can be home games for me and my product? Let's relay that back to that hypothetical discussion between an innovator and a farmer, where I'm asking them, like I'm saying, I can de-risk your operation, but I'm asking you to take a leap of faith and take this risk to even try it to get the breadcrumbs. Bring it back full circle, whatever the operation, whether it's, me and my cool lab, or whether it's, farmer and their operations, being able to structurally integrate some component of, call it prospecting, call it mining, call it just decision fidelity testing or whatever. I think you have to have that piece of it. You have to have reserve some share of your operational resources. And I mean that both in terms of money and time, really more time, I think, towards, strategic thought and the execution to underpin it, to focus on how you can shift those home field advantages. So if I'm a farmer and I've just been using this one input for forever, but I'm approached with, hey, I've got this other input, here's some of the benefits it can confer, I probably owe it to myself to try a little bit of my portfolio like that. And this is the way that, tech adoption works. You try it on a small plot, and then if it takes off, then, it scales from there. But that's also how you achieve that success, as a farmer utilizing new technology, or as an innovator who's seeing that technology get used. I think there's a mutual recognition of the risk, but also as part of the risk sharing, a willingness to say, hey, we're going to dedicate some component of our operations towards experimentation so that we can better position ourselves to be resilient for the future, so that we are 5 years from now not still relying on the same technology from today. Yeah, it might still pencil out 5 years from now, but will it pencil out 5 years from then?
Yep.
And to build for a resilient future, I think requires that additional and incremental time and money investment to, think about prospecting, think about other means of applying solutions within your operation.
Well, and at the risk of overcomplicating this yet again, or perhaps just revealing how complicated it is, we talked earlier in the show about sort of the knock-on effects of a strong strategy and what it allows you to do, how it allows you to see the world, how it allows you to compete better and differently, et cetera. Whether you're a farmer, an agribusiness operator, an incumbent, a startup, whatever it might be, wrestling with the fact of saying, look, our home field advantage over time, how likely is it, and in what form would it take if it was to be competed away? Just acknowledging the mortality of the advantage that you have economically and commercially in your business. Probably, this is completely speculative here. I don't have any data to back this up. Sharpens your pencil, sharpens your senses. If you're entertaining the possibility that your market position, your leading position today, could be gone tomorrow, that is going to, I think, accrue benefit to your strategic thinking. Either what can we do to preserve our advantage over a longer term, to your point, or is this actually an extinction level event? And we've now discovered the fact that in 3 cycles, we're going to be no different than a low-cost operator down the road. The only thing we'll have is the value of our relationships, and our relationships are going to fall to the wayside in the face of the narrow margin business that we're in. That in and of itself is probably a really important reckoning for business leaders and owners and operators to have, and sort of, leveling up their thinking around strategy and what to do next.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's a fantastic encapsulation of the incredibly complex conceptual topic. And I think one with which, literally hundreds of thousands of people across the industry grapple with every single day. So, I think being able to talk through the complexities of it and, the elements of what a well-formulated strategy are, those are the, going back to the whole notion of like, hey, is an input provider, you're providing insurance for your customer's operation? Well, formulating, and building a strategy that has taken into account multiple contexts, that has taken into account customer realities, that has taken into account more than the departments that have preceded you in your work life, that's de-risking your operation. That's providing insurance back to the plan that you're building going forward. Again, just because you have a plan doesn't mean that it's going to work. It doesn't mean that there's going to be success. It doesn't mean that executing against it perfectly is going to yield success either. But it's all about, maximizing the chance there. Like, what is the best position that you can put yourself in? And, I think just like de-risking customers, you have to, de-risk your own plan there. And that requires soliciting a lot of thought, testing it, thinking from different angles, and, making sure that you've got those empirical check-ins with the actual marketplace too, whether it's your commercial teams or, customer base too.
Well, I think that's a great place for us to leave it here today, Mac. And, for the folks that have gone the distance here for what is an extended episode, which we had fully anticipated would be, we are trying through peddling ideas, chewing on perspectives, trying to pull apart different things we're seeing. We're trying to help agribusiness operators de-risk strategy and improve execution by considering these multiple vectors, considering what we do well, considering what are the different realities and ways that this could show up. And so I just want to thank you for taking a significant amount of time out of your day to join us, to share some of this. And to our listeners, I want to say thank you for your patience as we kind of meandered around a little bit here and chewing on ideas. But I think that our industry benefits from having people like Mac in it, doing the work that you do, sharing the sometimes maybe non-consensus or non-obvious perspectives that you have. Whether you agree with some of the things you heard today or not, whether they're novel and new or not, whether they make you uncomfortable or angry or not, I think the more we can be thinking about the conceptual ways by which we develop strategy before we think about executing strategy, I think it's to the betterment of the business at the farm gate, the folks that serve the farm, and the value chain participants all along. So with all that said, Mac, I just want to say thanks again for taking the time today.
No, thanks for having me on, Joe. This was a lot of fun. Thanks to listeners for, again, sticking with some of my meandering thoughts here, but great discussion. There are no original thoughts out there. They're just new ways of contextualizing them. And, hopefully through the course of the discussion today, it's helped you think a little bit differently about some of the questions that have been, ruminating on your own operations already.
Well, now we have the title too, No Original Thoughts with Mac Marshall. No, thank you very much. I look forward to staying in touch, Mac, and having you on the show again. And to our listeners, thanks again for tuning in, for sticking with us today. I know that you found something not just of interest, but of value in our conversation. And with that, I'm going to ask you to consider doing one thing, and that's sharing this episode with someone that you think would find similar benefit. It's the very best way you can support our show and help us elevate thinking around strategy execution across the ag supply chain. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to having you join us again right here on the Pacesetter Pod.
This is the podcastfactory.com.